We're going to talk about the three periods of Greek supremacy, the first being the Archaic period, coming out of the Dark Ages, the second one being the Classical period, and the last one being the Hellenistic period. So first, coming out of the Dark Ages, villages and communities had evolved into city-states. And so we've heard a lot about this, of all the different city-states that were warring with one another during the Archaic period. They don't really become unified in any real sense until the Classical period. And even though then it's a fairly tenuous alliance. Because of the constant marauding off the coast, each village had evolved into its own sort of city-state, which would provide at least some form of democratic government, with elections, juries, and governments by citizens. Households were self-sufficient, producing food and clothing and protecting them from raiders. Therefore, women became particularly dependent on their husbands, and women definitely found themselves in a lesser role than certainly during the Minoan period. In the Archaic period, Greek colonies continued to expand after the brief collapse. And so this shows all of different Greek colonies in the region, so you can really see that they spread all through the Mediterranean Sea area. The statuary really resembles Egyptian statuary, although with even more detail. You can see from the pose of this statue's feet, it's very similar to the Egyptian style. Undoubtedly, through trade, the Greeks were looking at the artistry of the Egyptians. And so this is a piece that was created around 530 BCE. It's marble, 6 foot 4 inches high, and it's currently housed at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. Sometime around 530 BCE, a young man named Cheirosus died a hero's death in battle, and his family erected a Kouros statue over his grave at Anavisas, not far from Athens. The base reads, "Stay and mourn at the tomb of the dead Kouros, whom raging Ares destroyed one day as he fought in the foremost ranks." The statue still carries some paint. It is not a portrait of a specific person any more than the earlier Kouros, but it is far more naturalistic. His head is more proportional to its body, and the face is much more rounded, and the hair falls naturally over the back. And he has rounded, fleshy hips. So we're really seeing an extremely anatomically correct human, and it would have also been painted. So that's what we're realizing. Also, there's this second statue. So women in this period, especially, were always clothed in statuary. And this also reflects somewhat their status in society, the fact that the male body and the male naked form was the ideal, and women had a specific place in society that was not to be idealized in the same sort of way. This is called the Peplos Core from the Acropolis in Athens. It was also created in about 530 BCE, marble about 4 feet high. So the Peplos refers to the garment that she's currently wearing. We'll talk about the garment in a moment. The garment conceals her entire body, leaving only her head, hands, and feet showing, but the softer, more natural description is drastically different from earlier female Greek statues. So much paint remains that she was buried for more than 2 millennia. The Persians knocked over the statue when they attacked the Acropolis in 480 BCE, and the Athenians buried all damaged statues. So I'm showing you these two statues because they really show the growth of the culture of the Greeks. So you're going to see three statues for each civilization, each era of the Greeks. You can see how their culture evolves. So in discussing the peplos, we were talking about simple draped fabrics, not unlike what we've been talking about so far. And so essentially there are three-ish different ways that women would wear garments in the archaic period. The first being that they would wrap a piece around one side of their body and pin it at their shoulders. Either diagonally, as we're seeing in the first image, or just straight across and then tied at the waist. But there is also another version here where you let a little bit of the fabric hang down in front of the body for some extra interest. This would also be highlighted by the edge of the garment would also be highlighted probably by some kind of pattern or line or whatnot. And this is called the chiton. So the chiton specifically, and this here you can see the difference of it really hanging down. Now it could hang at points, it could be sort of totally wrapped around the body at this layer and pulled up, but it would always be pinned up at the shoulder. And so as we are looking at this, it evolves over time. So here's a simpler way to look at the chiton. You can see that it's one piece of fabric. You can see that the front half sort of gets folded down and then tied around the waist. So essentially what you need is the height of the wearer plus 12 inches, and it needs to be the width of the full arm span of the person. Here's another way to think about how this chiton was tied. So here's a woman tying it around her body. It may or may not have been open on one side. It may have been pulled around to overlap so you wouldn't see quite the same bit of form there that we're seeing. Here is, they did some costume recreations in the 30s of these things. So here is a woman with the chiton. You can see in this case the fabric is a bit thicker, and you can see that line on the garment at the selvage edge probably. Men would also wear chitons. They could be short or long. More often than not they were short, and they would usually reveal a lot of the men's body because fitness was valued. And so in this first version it's both of tied at the shoulders, but in this case here it is diagonal, showing some of the chest. Here's another recreation photo of what that may have looked like. This continues on into the Greek period, the Roman period, and so you can see that there's even more fabric gathered here with some extra over the shoulder. That comes a little later. There's other pieces of fabric called the hymation wrapped over the body. So the hymation was worn by both men and women. There's lots of statuary with philosophers or teachers or statesmen wearing just the hymation. Men would wear the chlamys, which is a kind of cloak popular in this period, fastened around the throat, usually with some kind of fastener. Here we have another drawing version of this. This man is also wearing a patassos, which is a kind of hat. Looks like a general wide-brimmed hat to keep the sun off. Here are general hairstyles on men and women, but they were clean-shaven and bearded. Curly hair was a trait of most people. They would take those curls and form them in certain ways. This style of hairstyle will eventually lead to women curling their hair specifically to look Grecian, when the classical looks are revived. We also have a Phrygian bonnet, which is a style probably picked up from trade with Persia. And we have all these different female hairstyles so these are the archaic hairstyles, definitely borrowing a bit from the Minoan period, certain coverings around the curls of the head, but then also that carrying on and leading to these different divisions in the headbands. We saw a resurgence of that style fairly recently, several years ago, of girls putting into their hair sort of like a double or a triple headband to sort of divide out the hair in a stylized way. There's more pictures of hairstyles taken from vases and whatnot. And a lot of the crowns and things like that have to come from statuary that were for goddesses and whatnot, but it is thought that they would have had, that women would have maybe had these sort of headdresses that would connect to veils and whatnot as they went about their business. Garments would have been decorated with what we call the Greek key, so it can be extremely simple to very complicated. This is also called a meander, which is a continuous line that is shaped into a repeated motif. The meander was an important symbol of ancient Greece, symbolizing infinity or the eternal flow of things. Many temples and objects were decorated with this motif, and it was considered that there is a connection with the Cretan labyrinth, so all the way back to Minos, what we were talking about. Indeed, the labyrinth can be drawn using a Greek tree. Greek key. These are some more Greek key patterns. There's also this sort of floral, maybe acanthus leaf sort of repetition here. And there's also all kinds of just different running patterns. Men would also be soldiers, and so Greek hoplite soldiers had a pretty consistent look, again, skirts, some kind of leather armor. This is they would have what we call greaves, which cover up to the knee, a helmet with feathers. This is more typical of what people would wear, unlike 300, where they're basically naked in fighting. It puts you at a real disadvantage if you're naked in fighting, because you're more likely to hurt yourself, although it does make, in the movie, people look a lot more awesome. So here's some impersonators of Greek hoplite soldiers. They just basically took research and recreated these things. These large shields could be used in different fascinating ways. One of my favorite things about 300 is how they show the use of those shields for different formations and shielding of arrows and different kind of tortoise shells and things like that. A major innovation of the archaic period was stucco. So you can see here that there's brick underneath, and they would take limestone and mix that with water and whatnot and go ahead and smooth that over rougher patches or any part of the architecture that was less aesthetically pleasing. They would cover it up to create a nice smooth surface. Now this is starting to wear away, but interiors of buildings now had the ability to be smooth, and so we would see in interiors nice, really smooth walls, not just plaster, but a really strong sort of stucco that may have had a texture to it. We stucco things all the time, but then would be painted on as well. The construction of temples in the archaic period began with the most simple form here. So this is the Athena Nike in Athens, but there would be simply a colonnade, so just a series of columns, much like we saw in Egypt, in the front and the back, on something we would call a portico or porch, so in front of the actual religious area, which would be called the cella. And so the cella would be where priests would be able to go, or priestesses, and often there would be some kind of votive in the middle, or altar, or representation of the god. And so this is sort of the early, an early architectural version of that. It gets much more complicated later. So they're simply, there's more simple and more complicated versions, which we're going to look at. They all have names, but really what it breaks down to is how elaborate the porch area is. But there's always a cella, and sometimes there are secondary rooms for the keeping of precious items, or for secret, sacred rites and whatnot. This is the back room, is called pronaos, Pronoas, but that's just for your own knowledge. These temples were considered to be the actual dwelling of a particular god that they could choose to inhabit, and that's why there was often a cult statue. More specifically, even though the image I just showed you has Ionic columns, we're going to talk about Doric specifically in this period, because Doric was the most popular. Now, Ionic columns and architecture orders did exist during this time period, but for ease and simplicity, I am equating the Archaic period directly with the Doric order. And so here we see the Doric order is generally the shorter order. It's the columns do not reach as high. It's not quite as monumental as we will get to, say, in the Corinthian during the Hellenistic period. But this shows you still that we have the post and lintel construction. So we've got this architrave, we've got the post, which is the shaft of the capital. And then we have a frieze section here in the middle, which is decorative, that hides some of the construction of the roof. And then a cornice, which goes along the top of the building. And this is similar to what we were talking about with the cornice in Egypt. It keeps your eye, it gives your eye a place to land as it travels up the building. This is the Parthenon in Athens, and so this is a complicated but pretty clear, direct version of a Doric order style. And the image that you're actually looking at is they rebuilt the Parthenon. They've rebuilt the Parthenon all over the world. But I think this one in particular is in Nashville. I would actually go to this in the park. It was very close to where I lived when I lived in Nashville. It's just really sort of neat to get to actually walk through it, and not as a ruin, as something that's been rebuilt. I think it was in a smaller scale. I think it was something like 3-to-1. So it was about the third of the size that it is in reality. It's much easier to build when it's smaller, and for a public work, it's cheaper, right? But here we also see that there were columns inside the actual cella as well for a second level. If we were to look at what this looks like on the inside, so this is a temple to Athena. Here's her cult statue. That you can see that there's the main room, and then there's a secondary room back behind there. There's also columns all around the side, not just on the front porch. They surround, but 2 rows in the front. We don't know what the statue of Athena and the Parthenon really look like. We have descriptions from historians, but it was probably quite impressive. You can see the scale of the human to the interior. We know what that distance is, but there would be a second level here that people could be on as well. And so what you would see is a second layer of columns supporting the area, the clerestory area above here. And you can see the light pouring in onto the statue. The statue would have been covered in gold leafing. So here's a recreation of what people think the statue may have looked like. Here is a more detailed version of some of the architectural words that you're going to learn in the Doric order. So here's the architrave, and it's broken up into the metope, the triglyph, and then the horizontal and raking geisons that are a part of the overall pediment. So the pediment is this larger area. And then there is this overall cornice called the raking cyma. So all of this ties into the structure, the overall structure, and all of this is guided by mathematical proportions. You can't just sort of guess at this. In order to look correct, it breaks down in a specific way. Even dealing with corners and how these things relate to the width of the building versus the corner really matters. And these things shift a bit during the Roman period and then get played with quite a bit as these buildings are revived. The other note to these buildings is that they would have been colored. So we have coloring here of a painting specifically. Usually it's about 2 different colors. Here's the red and blue. And then each bit of ornament would have other colors within them. And I'm going to pause here before we begin talking about the class.